Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight we're interviewing a PhD linguist named Brian Collins.
How are you doing, my good sir? It's nice to finally get to talk to you.
I'm doing all right. Yeah, it's just it's just sort of early in the day here, so I haven't really been up to much except for preparing for this.
All right, cool. So tell our audience a bit about yourself.
So I study phonology, so it's basically how what I'm studying specifically is how people acquire sound categories and how they basically form rules from those and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my first encounter with you was on Quora, and what interested me about you is how you got into talking about Dan Everett and I believe his son.
Yeah, Kate Everett. They've both been pretty controversial in linguistics and anthropology.
I believe they were both trying to overturn, I believe Noam Chomsky's the rules that Noam Chomsky laid out.
Yeah, generative grammar. It's sort of it's the dominant theory of linguistics in basically the U.S., Canada, and most of Western Europe. But it's not universally accepted. It's just sort of the dominant theory.
That's good. Yeah, I always did know that Noam Chomsky was pretty popular. I know because he's more known, although I find funny enough for his politics than he is really for anything else.
Yeah, I actually hadn't ever heard of his politics until I was an undergrad in linguistics and I started reading his other works. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us
political.
Tell us about Everett's controversy.
So it started it sort of started in the 90s, but
would you say he's the Ron Wyatt of linguistics or anthropology?
Who's Ron Wyatt?
That guy that put the chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea and all that.
Oh. Maybe. Basically though, in his early career, he was a Mormon. I think he was a Mormon missionary. He was some sort of Christian missionary, and he went to the Amazons. And a lot of linguists actually get into linguistics because they document some indigenous language for their for religious reasons, basically to translate the Bible into it. But then they just get interested in language because of that, and then they go and become linguists. So he basically did that. And in the mid-2000s, he wrote this paper. I have to go. It was called Piraha Exceptionality, I believe. But yeah, I just got to go get the exact title.
That would be rather exceptional for a hunter-gatherer indigenous tribe to be atheists or empiricists. That just reeks of fantasy.
Yeah, so it was called Cultural Constraints on Grammar and Cognition. Piraha, another look at design features of human language. And he also wrote another paper that year, Piraha Exceptionality. And basically he argued that it was mostly an argument against universal grammar and also Hockett's principal design features of language. So Hockett's principal features are basically that every language has this certain number of things, such as basic color terms, displacement, embedding, recursiveness, all these things like that. And Everett was basically saying that this pet language he studied doesn't have these, so the theory's wrong. And he started arguing that Piraha has the immediacy of experience constraint instead going on, where speakers are forced to only talk about things they can see right in front of them. So in universal grammar, the theory is basically that there's this part of the human brain that gives humans a natural endowment for language. So if that theory is what you believe, then it wouldn't be expected that culture would be affecting language in the way that Dan Everett is arguing. So he was trying to argue basically that there's this Sapir-Whorf type cultural thing going on, and that is what is driving all the Piraha's lack of many things that most languages have.
I believe one claim that he had made is that they didn't have creation stories or
deities of any kind.
Yeah, that one is actually pretty funny because there were three linguists a couple years after Everett wrote this. Three linguists, Nevins, Pasetsky, and Rodriguez, wrote this paper against his claims because at the time Dan Everett was getting interviewed on NPR and he was all over the media talking about basically how everything's wrong because Piraha lacks all these things. And they actually quoted a creation myth in their paper, which I thought was really funny. Yeah. Creation myth. I've just got to find it.
Yeah. I was just thought it was pretty funny because when you actually do know a bit about their culture, which I think he sort of took advantage of that. I don't know how common, it was for people to go there and study that specific tribe. So I think he sort of just took advantage of the fact that there wasn't really a lot of information there currently.
Yeah, I suspect that could be the case, but honestly, I'm not sure. He might have really actually never bumped into a Piraha creation myth. Every time somebody brings one up to him, he kind of deflects and says that they borrowed it from another culture or something, but it would still violate his immediacy of experience constraint. I found the creation myth actually. Basically, it's just sort of starts off like, in the beginning of the world, the first level immediately above that of the Piraha was situated much lower than it is today. It was situated very close to the level in which they live. The moon, when it rose, appeared very low. One day at night, a man decided to shoot arrows at the moon. He climbed in a high tree and released the arrow. So already at the very beginning, a lot of this stuff violates the idea that Piraha can only talk about the stuff that's immediately right in front of them, or something somebody in the tribe experienced recently that a living person did.
So they can't talk about Australia where you're at with anybody. if they ran into a foreigner.
Yeah, there were things that in the grammar of Piraha that also Everett tried to argue is related to this. So, for instance, there was a big discussion about possession. So, in English, we have recursive possession. So, we can say things like John's dog's doghouse, and both John and the dog are possessing something. So John possesses the dog that possesses the doghouse. Piraha lacks this, and linguists are basically not arguing that Piraha actually has it. So Everett proposed data on it. Actually, if I showed it to you in Skype, would you be able to display it or?
Sure.
Yeah, if it's on a share screen.
Oh, shared screen. That would be easy to do. How would I? Which button is that one in Skype?
It's the three button,
yeah, great.
the three dots.
All right. Opening system preferences. All right, start sharing. Okay. And now I'm getting the tilde wheel.
All right. Nice mountains.
Oh, can you see just my background or?
Yeah, I can see your background.
The forest, the mountains.
All right. I am going. Wait a second.
Where's this at?
I think this one's Yosemite.
Huh.
Wait a second.
Is it mayor named Sam?
That's from the cartoon, right?
Yeah, Yosemite Sam.
Okay. Yeah, I turned share screen off because it was only sharing the share screen, share application window. That's it. All right, start sharing.
All right, cool.
Is this working now or no?
We can see.
Is it showing a page now?
No, it's showing you.
Oh, that's annoying.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I guess that might not work, but in any case, I think I could send it in the messages.
Mm-hmm.
So, dropping that file in. Then I'll take one more screenshot on.
All right, I see it.
Example. So this is basically showing that Piraha doesn't have possessive recursion. So you can't say John's dog's house. But the problem with that is German also doesn't have it. So it's actually not that exact, because if we thought that, so he's arguing that because Piraha doesn't have this feature, it's evidence that they have an immediacy of experience constraint. But Germans also can't talk about John's dog's house. Instead, they'd have to use some other structure to say that. Hansen's Auto's Motor, that's ungrammatical in German. But John's car's motor is grammatical in English. Just like in Piraha, German doesn't allow recursive pronominal possessors.
That is actually interesting. How, considering, I'd imagine how that would go like in a conversation. I would imagine how trying to, one of them trying to learn a language.
Yeah, I mean, there's always really big differences between languages, and I imagine it would be hard for a Piraha speaker to learn English. But that also segues to another claim. So at one point, Everett also claimed that Pirahas are mostly monolingual, despite extensive contact with Portuguese and other Brazilians. But then he starts claiming in his glosses, he says things like, Piraha told me in Portuguese.
Does he even know Portuguese? Or Spanish or anything?
He has to know Portuguese to have worked in Brazil for that long. He was there for years. I don't know if he speaks Spanish, but he probably speaks Portuguese. And
at least he has enough familiarity with it.
Yeah, I'm sure he could have held a conversation and gotten around, because even not working with the Piraha, he would have had to interact with like local authorities and stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of missionaries are trained pretty well actually in the local language.
And going on that, didn't this deconversion have an influence on his conclusions about the tribe?
That's what I suspect. I mean, basically.
Actually, he converted to atheism. You don't deconvert.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to call it, but his loss of faith from Christianity to atheism. He sometimes, in some of his other works, I haven't actually read his works other than on Piraha, but some of his works I've heard about. I've seen cited where he's talking about his experiences. He says he bumped into problems when he was talking to the Piraha, so he told them he was talking about Jesus, and they were asking questions like, is Jesus brown like us or white like you? Well, did your father tell you about Jesus? He must have seen him. And so that type of stuff sort of it seems to have at least influenced the immediacy of experience or principle, and also influenced his own faith, I think. Because basically they were asking questions like, well, why are you telling us about Jesus if you've never seen him and you have never known anybody who met him? So then that sort of is almost what Everett is claiming with the immediacy of experience principle. So he's saying that the Piraha can't talk about things that they've never seen or never met anybody who's seen.
This is a reversal of what happened with the Bantu tribe in Africa, for instance. They always believed in one almighty creator God. In the 19th century, missionaries went there and talked about God, and they're like, oh, so you know of God too? They just call God a different name. Like, so you know of God too? What's he like?
Well, a thing that's interesting is that he was making them out like he was making out the pariah to be like these empiricists and stuff like this, but pariah are very spiritual people. They believe in spirits.
Yeah, and they have creation myths. And yeah, it's just I honestly don't understand how he came to that conclusion. I mean, I feel like after he proposed the immediacy of experience principle, that was what sort of drove that conclusion that they're the ultimate empiricists.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really say it, but I believe in one Quora post you argue that they're more likely polytheists and they call their gods spirits.
Yeah.
Or they're at least a form of animist.
Yeah, it could just even be a translation thing. So he's calling these supernatural beings, they believe in spirits, and so they're not creators. It can be an exception to his immediacy experience principle. But I mean, it's hard to translate one religion into another from a completely different culture. You don't really there's often not exactly a one for one when you're doing that.
Oh yeah, I mean, anyone that really studies, let's say, studies, I don't know, Christianity and the language of Hebrew grammar would be able to tell you that unlike, I believe, modern English, where I'm trying to think of what our modern language is like. I know that at least in the case of Hebrew language, it's more verb dominated, while our language is not really.
Yeah, a lot of the morphology and stuff in Afro-Asiatic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, it's really verb centric. But what I was thinking of even was more like just concepts. Like, so in Christianity, you have the Trinity. Imagine if you were translating this into a different religion. So you're trying to explain what Christians believe in. You might even just say something like Christians believe in three gods. They believe in God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, God the Son, and of course Christians wouldn't agree with that, but it might just be the easiest way to explain it to a different culture. And so when he's using the term spirit, they might even be more than just spirits. They might be better translated as gods, but he's just trying to get it, trying to basically put a square block through a round hole and explain it.
Like, is there anybody else that can go to these people and talk about them so we don't have a one-sided opinion?
There's been a few. So the creation myth actually came from a different source. That one, I have to figure that one out. But yeah. So absence of creation myths. And this one,
I believe to get into contact with these tribes, I believe you have to get a lot of permits for that.
Yeah, Brazil, some countries aren't very restrictive. They just kind of let you do whatever. But Brazil's a lot more, at least at the time Everett was working on this stuff, they were very protective of the Amazons. They're not so much anymore, as you probably heard in the news with all the bush burning junk, but yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. So, okay.
Are certain tribes related, or are some of them isolated?
Yeah, so the Piraha they speak a language. I believe they speak an it was either a Carib or an Arawakan language. I'm going to Google this very quickly.
Are they related to the Arareo tribe?
Yeah, they're distantly related to other groups, for sure.
That one tribe discovered in '98.
Yeah.
Wasn't discovered them, but they They bulldozed the area and they were welcoming the white man.
Yeah,
Sort
they're it's a Muro language family. So there's other Muro Watanwe languages. Yeah, so it's not an isolate. There are some languages out there that are isolates, like Basque isn't related to any other language, but yeah, Piraha's not in that situation.
I mean, when I was hearing about them only being able to think in the present, I was thinking about many Native American tribes because I've heard many Native American tribes are sort of like that, where they focus more on their immediate surroundings so much. They might have some more concepts of like the future, but they're sort of more grounded in the now. I think that's what some Native American tribes, I couldn't name them off the top of my head.
Yeah, but it's not. I'm just sending you a couple of references. There was one other author who's written on the Piraha. I don't know to say her name exactly. I think it's or male actually. His name. It's probably Goncalves or something. He's Portuguese. But yeah. There's been other claims. And there might be cultures that even talk more about the now and not as much about the past. Like there's a lot of cultural preferences out there, but often they're just preferences. They're not so much concrete things. Like English speakers talk about use the passive voice a lot more than Germans. So we talk about things like the car was broken into instead of X broke into the car. But we're not prohibited from saying X broke into the car. It's just a cultural preference.
Makes sense. Yeah. I do think it is interesting though that we do get to learn some a bit about these tribes because I don't think there's really many of them, at least not of this group particularly.
Yeah, there's only 300 Piraha, so it is good that we had that Everett at least made a sketch grammar. But that actually segues to another controversy. So a lot of his claims about immediacy of experience directly contradicted his sketch grammar. So when he wrote his long sketch grammar, he included a section on color terms, for instance, and numbers. But then when he rewrote his when he basically said that he was wrong on all of these because this wasn't really a color term or this wasn't really a number. And it just sort of added more fuel to the controversy because he was sort of contradicting himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I believe that ties into his claim that, like, about them being monolingual.
Yeah, he's monolingual, but then he's also saying X said to me in Portuguese, and it's hard to rectify those two things.
Yeah, I mean, because it does seem to me that if they clearly, it's hard to say that they're monolingual, like they're only having one language, when it's very clear that there is definitely influence from other places. It's like, it would be like saying Florida is monolingual when the fact of the matter is that, at least in my neighborhood, like we sort of have it sectioned out where basically you have the rednecks in one section, you have the Spanish rednecks in another, and you got the Asian rednecks like right across the block. So I mean, you do sort of get like you would be hard to say, oh, we're monolingual. I'm like, no, we're not.
Yeah, there's multiple languages in the community, and Brazil speaks Portuguese mostly, so it's I mean. Anybody who's in the Piraha community who has any sort of like administrative job or anything would have to be able to speak some Portuguese.
I was wondering, like, because I know this might go back to Native American tribes, but I wondered, are they tribal like that where they have a chief, like their government per se?
I haven't looked too much into their social structure. I don't know actually.
I would imagine it would go because that's a thing I've noticed in at least small tribes where they'll have like a tribal chief.
Yeah.
Like it'll be just this one guy that says this is our guy, or something like that. It all depends really on the groups.
Or a shaman, but Everett probably didn't.
Yeah, he wouldn't want to say shaman.
Yeah, the shaman wouldn't look good on him. Yeah, but I mean,
There's a lot of atheists online that actually think this. They actually think that there's an atheist hunter-gatherer indigenous tribe.
Yeah, it's kind of it sounds very strange. I don't know how. I don't know why Everett is nailing that one down so hard. Like it's his most exotic claim out of all of them, which is I don't know why he's focusing so much on that one.
No,
well,
but
That's
especially
incredible.
with his conversion, and I think it's always to counter the claim that, like, I think I met many anthropologists and many other people that work in this sort of field where they say, there's pretty much always some notions of deities or some religious elements in just every tribe we can see. And I think he's sort of just trying to say, hey, look, no, there's this one exception right here.
and it
I think
happened,
that's part.
it happened to be around the time he became an atheist.
Yeah, I can see that. So he's wanting to make it seem like here's an exception. These people don't believe in a deity, therefore it's not universal. And I don't know why you would need to argue that though. Like I don't think just even if every culture on Earth had a deity, it doesn't necessarily prove a deity exists. Like it's not a very good argument strategy in my opinion.
Well, yeah, that would be an argument ad populum.
Yeah, it's like it's like as bad as Everett basically trying to argue that universal grammar isn't true because there's this weird language out there.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's typically, like, I would say, like, at least in social sciences, there is recognized that there can be anomalies.
Yeah. And a lot of his anomalies are as we saw with the German example, like they're not that anomalous. And actually with Everett that it actually color terms aren't universal. So I earlier sent you this this chart of the Nawa colors. But one of my friends actually, when I did my master's degree at the University of Utah, and one of my friends there, he's actually Mormon, and he worked with the Nawa people. And when we were discussing Everett, the topic came up, and I thought it was just very interesting that Nawa, this other language, so I was kind of arguing, like, it's so implausible that a language doesn't have colors, and then he's like, well, actually, one language I'm working on might not, and he basically showed me data where in Nawa, they don't really have colors. They have this sort of this tick suffix that they attach to nouns, and it makes a color. So there'll be something, maybe golds will be coes or something, and then they'll stick tick onto it, and now it's yellow, and just stuff like that. And when you look at their colors, it gives you the impression that their language has just a ton of colors, like a level of color complexity that's so complicated you wouldn't expect it. But in reality, it's just they're sticking this color word onto nouns. And I think that this actually shows that Everett is right on this point, that not all languages have color terms. So, but also it shows that it's also not that unique in the first place if another language doesn't do it.
Like,
Yeah.
So it's not evidence of the immediacy of experience principle.
Which is, I think, one of his biggest things that he tries to get through.
Yeah.
I believe his son is also into the language things as well.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
I was just saying, I believe he has a kid that's involved and
Oh yeah, Caleb Everett. I have mixed feelings about him, but basically he is an anthropologist who does a lot of work in linguistics, and he's tried attacking. He's also attacking UG, but instead he's been using mass amounts of data. So he goes out there, grabs this thing that just came up off the top of his head, like maybe languages in mountains have adjectives, and languages in lowlands don't. And then he takes a map of all the languages in the world and basically labels all the languages with the sound as black and all the languages without the sound as white, and then says, look, all the languages near mountains all the languages near mountains have this sound, or more languages near mountains do than languages not near mountains. Therefore, it's caused by altitude. And he wrote this really controversial paper where he was arguing that high altitude is what's causing languages to have ejective stops. So ejective stops are like they have a release of rarefied air. So some languages like Quechua have a contrast between t and t is the ejective sound. And Quechua happens to be spoken in the Andes, and there's some other languages in Papua New Guinea that are spoken in high altitude that have that sound. So he was basically trying to argue that high altitude is what's causing that sound to exist, or at least influence it and make it more likely to evolve. And I thought that even the way he was operationalizing high altitude made no sense. So I live in Australia now, but I'm actually originally from Washington State in the U.S. And in Washington State, we have a couple of languages with those sounds. They're Salishan languages spoken in the Puget Sound. They're spoken at sea level, like in Puyallup and stuff like that. But they pop up in Caleb Everett's map as languages with adjectives that are spoken in high altitude, because he's defining high altitude as close to a mountain, basically, which is a problem because not all languages spoken near a mountain are actually spoken at high altitude.
Well, I mean, that's sort of that. I would imagine that would be troubling. I mean, like near a mountain, like does that mean like at the bottom of the mountain, like in a tribe that just happens to live right by it?
That's the data he ended up with. Was most of the languages, I'm pretty sure, are at sea level, just spoken at the base of a mountain.
But has high altitude ever, factored in really when it comes to languages and how humans may talk in them?
I think it could have effects, but mostly I would, if you twisted my arm, I wouldn't be surprised if there were effects in hearing, because at high altitude the air's thinner. Like if you're in a plane flight, even when they set the pressure to 8,000 feet, you have to talk a bit louder even for the person next to you to hear you, and everything just sounds a bit quieter. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was actually some perceptual things going on at high altitude. But I think the way Caleb Everett went about investigating that was just kind of didn't operationalize it in the right way. And also, I don't think it would be ejective stops. I think it would probably have effects on the vowels. But this is just me speculating. It's not, I mean, there's not actually been any, other than Everett's study, there hasn't been any attempts to even investigate this. So this type of thing is the type of research that most linguists wouldn't even touch with a 17-foot pole, because it's just, it's easy when you start looking for statistical correlations, it's easy to find a statistical correlation that just happened by chance when you don't have a very good research question. So if you're asking, does altitude affect anything, then you can just start looking at everything, and then you happen to find this one thing that happens to correlate with altitude, but you've been investigating so many possible correlations that there's a statistical chance that the correlation you're investigating just happened by random chance because you were investigating so many possible things.
Well, I mean, don't you know, man, that butter can have the amount of butter that's consumed in the U.S. can have an effect on the marriage rates?
Yeah, that type of stuff. Like when you start investigating everything and you don't have a defined research question, like if you ask a very vague question like how does X affect Y without a good hypothesis as to why or anything, you can end up with just any sort of correlation. Like maybe proximity to India increases traffic deaths. That type of stuff.
Strangely enough, I came across these sensational studies that say that chimps and prairie dogs have language. What do you make of that?
What exactly is the study?
Forgot the names of them, but they insist that they know these types of languages because this one guy was studying them for 40 years.
Hmm.
Biblical number, by the way.
Honestly, I have an open mind, and I wouldn't be surprised if some animals out there did have a form of communication that would match most, if not all, the definitions for human language. But I also don't think that it's been definitively shown yet at all.
That
Sure.
is
Like,
nice. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised either, because I do know like some animals have been taught to do sign language by gorillas.
yeah, a lot of gorillas and chimps were taught sign language, and they weren't. The argument though they didn't speak sign language really is basically that they there were a lot of really controversial papers in the 70s that were basically trying to say chimps can't do language. Look at their sign language; it's really crazy because their sign language wasn't exactly like how humans would sign it, and it wasn't as constrained. So they must just not know grammar. That was sort of the argument. And a lot of those studies had big problems because there were just so many confounds. Like, I forgot the name, but this one linguist, actually, no, he was a psychologist. Um, Basically, he tried teaching chimps how to talk by raising them like human babies. So he dressed them in diapers and, like, exposed them to the same type of input that a human infant would have. And the problem with that is, like, none of that is all of that could be a confound. So it could be that maybe even wearing a diaper was distracting the chimp, and now the chimp isn't signing right because of that. Like, you never know.
It's,
And
it's a study by hold on, what's this guy's name? Biologist Konslobodchikov. I try saying that 5 times.
okay, the dog study.
Yeah, prairie dog study.
All right, could you type the name in here so I could see how it's spelled?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would probably be helpful. 'Cause I think that would be a foreign name.
There was a linguistics group at the University of Utah researching. Most of them are biologists, but they're researching sparrow syntax. So basically, in sparrow songs, there's evidence of oh, okay, Konslobodchikov. But
This one's Arizona.
all right.
The last
There we
name
go.
sounds like it could be the name of a rifle.
All right, I see it. Can prairie dogs talk? I see. Okay, I see the New York Times article. All right.
Well, Paris can talk, but they mainly just imitate us.
Well, I mean, I do know that there is a big debate going on amongst veterinarians about whether or not dogs can feel guilt.
I think I wouldn't be surprised if dogs could, but I also don't think that their emotional centers would be the same as humans. Like, I think they still definitely have emotions, but their whole frontal lobe is completely different because they have a olfactory gland that's like the size of a fist stuck on the front of their brain. And with humans, our smell centers are connected with our brains, but they're a lot smaller. So I imagine that if dogs, I mean, I'm speculating, but I imagine that dogs' emotions would be a lot more tied into smells than human emotions would be.
That makes sense.
And
It's
there's
like imagine some blind people would sort of be.
Yeah, when people sort of have a lack of a sense, other senses sort of compensate.
Yeah.
there's
So it's
also
not-
there's this other sensational a study on the chimps and bonobos for however decades. You heard of this guy, Franz de Waal?
Franz de Waal, I think I might have actually.
What do you
What
make
was you again?
What do you make of all that?
I remember the name, but I'm not. I don't exactly remember which paper did which.
you mean the capuchin monkey like income equality or whatever, or equity or whatever?
Oh,
Yeah.
those ones.
Yeah,
Um,
the moral ethical framework.
Yeah, where he's arguing that human moral ethical frameworks are framed sort of by these things that we can see in primates. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe, but I think that ethics are a lot more abstract. So I don't think that that basically every single thing that humans do can just be chimpified.
They're trying to argue that they think and plan and do strategy for infiltrating another tribe and having a sense of fairness and having even having pets and organizing hunting for bush babies.
Well, I mean,
Animal intelligence doesn't really surprise me. I mean, if somebody said that sparrows were speaking English, yeah, I'd think that was baloney. But like, I don't know. There's a lot. It's very difficult to research exactly what animals know because you can't ask them questions. So it's just a lot of unknowns.
I mean, we know dogs have personality and
Yeah,
stuff in dolphins, but
yeah, it's pretty common.
yeah, it's not really anyone's really doubting like if dogs, have emotions. I don't think that's ever been thing. It's like we know that much, but the question is like, how deep do their thoughts go?
Yeah.
Like
Do they
if
feel,
someone's gonna ask me, like, does a dog cry? Does it feel like pain, or does it, like, does it feel happy? Does it feel sad? Like, those kind of things. Yeah, yeah, definitely dogs can do that. Like what we generally see is like, do they have a sense of, empathy? Do they have, more deeper, complex sort of emotions that we would associate with humans? That's more what they go with. Like that's more what people want. They are generally going into. Guilt is a big thing because if you can see animals that can feel guilt, because that applies to multiple different factors. Because they have to be able to assess a situation, be able to recognize themselves and that they did something wrong.
yeah, it shows. I mean, I've always thought that the people arguing that animals are not self-aware is just it's kind of almost silly. Like it's hard to operationalize what self-awareness exactly is. Like, it's just one of those wishy-washy terms. And so, is if a dog feels sad that he ate some other dog's food, does that show he's self-aware? I mean, I feel like even if for a lot of these experiments, even if you get a result that shows that yes, they feel guilty, yes, they do X, Y, and Z. Does that mean they're self-aware? There's still some skeptic who can be like, oh, well, they're not really self-aware. It doesn't really show it because you can define self-awareness this way.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, the biggest problem is it's with studying anyone really, is that we can't really get inside their mind to know what their thoughts are.
speaking of
are humans self-aware? I mean, we recognize our own reflection in the mirror. Oh, there, we're self-aware, but like, it's just kind of, yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of,
I do think it's. I think it can have implications in some circumstances, depending on animal ethics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I just don't like it when people try to draw conclusions about human ethics from that type of stuff. Like, for instance, there was this. Did you guys hear about the study about the babies where they had some babies and basically they had one stuffed animal do a mean thing to another stuffed animal, and then the babies were like basically preferring the stuffed animal that they were more sympathetic to. There's been a lot of infant research like that too, and basically then people say like, oh well, all this stuff in culture is innate, and it must be universal because infants can do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, because culture and ethics, I feel like, are way more abstract. Like people think about them. People have been writing on those topics for 4,000 years. It's obviously not at the state of nature, in my opinion, at least.
Speaking of the innate things, it's going back to what we were talking about earlier. There was a book recently that contradicts what was his name?
Dan Everett.
Yeah, his findings that sense in a higher power is innate among humans by Justin Barrett, called Born Believers.
I mean, when it comes to Barrett, I do think he did play an integral. He is bringing up some interesting stuff. I think there is people that go even farther than him, like Evans. I can't remember his first name, but I know he works in sort of the same field, where he more or less goes that people are just intuitive believers. There are some people that make more moderate assumptions where they say that while there is some innateness, it's more, cultural appropriation and how those interact.
Yeah, he was arguing that it's in babies and children. Also, what do you make of that?
It sounds a lot like the God gene type stuff. Am I right? Or
It sounds similar to it, but
yeah, it's basically
It's more behaviorism and like neuroscience wise.
yeah, it's basically just the idea that people that some people have an innate belief in a higher power or are more susceptible to it and other people aren't, that type of thing. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was true, but I also don't know how important that is. And there's also been I've seen some weirder research where people then take that and are like, well, let's look at the proportions of people with these genes or whatever in this society versus this one. And this is why people in Ghana are much more likely to believe in God than people in the Netherlands. It's just it's taking it too far, in my opinion.
It's just genetic fallacy.
Getting into animal ethics is, for one, is even more complicated because, like, with human ethics, you pretty much can realize like every 100 or 200 years, pretty much all of the ethics just turn on their head.
Yeah.
If you extract that, over a long period of time, like say hundreds, like millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years at most, you can imagine how many times what we would call ethics had to change through that.
Yeah, even like recently, in my lifetime, even with like LGBT rights. When I was a kid, it was immoral, X, Y, and Z. Like, you can't do this. And then slowly over time, it just changed in the U.S. And there's also been changes in terms of like greed. Like, it's become a lot more since like the 50s, like just sort of displays of wealth have been a lot more socially accepted, and in general, like people who don't accumulate wealth have been sort of viewed as more immoral than in the past, that type of stuff. And even when you're looking at ethical systems, there's just a ton of diversity with humans' cultures. Like, Japanese ethics are very different from American ethics or Canadian ethics. And so I just don't know how much of a role nature is playing in those.
Yeah, speaking of which, there's God gene, and then there's the gay gene that some people think is actually a thing.
Yeah, that type of stuff too.
Well, here's the thing I even noticed about that. A lot of times they confuse orientation with behavior. There's a subtle difference between the two. Orientation has to do what you desire with. Behavior has more to do with what you actually do.
Yeah, and a lot of times also I've been seeing animal research where basically they find a lot of animals that have sex with members of both sexes, and then they're like, okay, well this proves that homosexuality is innate. And I think, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if bisexuality was closer to innate. Like, I feel like all the a lot of cultural restrictions, a lot of restrictions on like on just sexuality in general are more cultural. Like in ancient Rome, probably like 20 or 30% of people were acting in bisexual ways, and in ancient Greece too. Before before all the religions came over from the Middle East and changed that up. So like, I don't know.
I mean, yeah.
Then there's also animals that eat their own feces, and one could argue that's innate.
It's innate. The dog did it.
Well, I mean, whenever they do show that sort of stuff, is like animals do it, therefore we should do it. I'm like, you do know that many animals eat their young, right?
Yeah, or they kill they kill the other pack's leader and then eat all the descendants of the pack.
That's
leader.
lions.
Yeah, lions do that a lot. Yeah, I mean,
their kids' babies.
There's these guys observing how, like, look how human they are. Like, why aren't you doing anything to stop it? Stop all this senseless killing among them.
Well, it's entertaining. I imagine that goes into it.
I don't know about that, but yeah, I feel like it's not really the individual researchers who are drawing these conclusions so much. So like the biologist in the field looking at a lion eating the young, they're just kind of like, wow, that's brutal, and just kind of records it. And then somebody then reads that and then tries to draw some moral conclusions out of it.
Even Neanderthals did that.
Huh?
Even Neanderthals did that. Killed their own when they were a liability to them.
Humans have done. I mean, they haven't. I don't know of cannibalism like that, but humans have killed off the young of rivals, like political. The mafia even has done stuff like that in American culture in the past.
Yeah.
Like,
well, yeah, generally, like I have actually looked that up, and at least in ancient times, like it was common when resources were very scarce, that they would just kill the kids.
Yeah, or kill the kids of like the peasants or something, and yeah, just stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, like I know those are more extreme situations. Like, although I do think sometimes people over exaggerate with like those things and sort of to say that the ancient people were immoral. I'm like, no, you didn't live their lives.
Yeah, Pinker's Better Angels book, that just reminded me of that, or something like that title, where basically he's talking about how people in the past were very brutal, and nowadays we live in these much better times.
Oh, I've done
horrible
on him.
Yeah,
these things are horrible. You got fucking drag queens trying to read to kids and touching them and stuff, and trying to sexualize kids in nature. Like,
yeah, in the way of ancient Rome.
Yeah, and got all these sexual fetishes going on in some pride parades. Like everything's just so backwards. It doesn't make any sense.
I don't know. I disagree with sexualizing kids and stuff, but yeah, I don't know. It's just I think what he was mostly talking about was like murder and like talking about atrocities and things like that just decreasing over time.
Well, people still do atrocities, like in the 20th century alone.
Yeah, we have Bashar al-Assad doing all this shit in Syria and things like that.
Well, yeah. The funny thing is that he sort of assumes that murder and things like rape mean the exact same thing over hundreds of years.
Yeah, consent has changed a lot even in the last 3 centuries. Like 3 centuries ago, if a husband forced himself upon his wife, it wasn't rape because he was sort of the custodian of the household or whatever. I mean, I don't agree with that, of course, but it was just the laws and morality have changed in general, even in the last 300 years of time.
I mean, they even had that. There was a scene about that in Gone with the Wind, even though it was rated G.
Wow, I never knew that.
No, like they got in an argument and he just carried her upstairs when she didn't want to, but probably don't remember that part. But
I've never seen that movie actually, but yeah.
Well, yeah,
oh man,
it is interesting though to look it up. I mean, what people do generally believe though is that cultures do generally have general principles that they go over that they believe in. It's more or less how they express them is what matters. I like to use, for example, let's say the biblical one, like honor thy mother and father. Well, what does that exactly mean? If I get like, there's millions of ways I could express loving my parents and honoring them. So I mean, it's not really like it's clear what how. I think that one could say that there's sort of moral principles that generally people believe in. If anything, just to get along with each other.
Yeah, and it's odd that they even express stuff like that explicitly. Like it has to be expressed. I feel like sometimes too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. All right. Well, we're coming up on the hour.
All right.
before we leave, tell us about your adventures.
Yeah, I wanted to actually, I neglected to do this before, but I wanted to tell you, how did you get into your field and what got you interested?
So basically, I was actually a chemistry major, and I got a D- in calculus, and then the same quarter I got an easy A in anthropology of language, and I also found the topic pretty interesting. I had studied German in high school, and I always thought like the etymological connections between like German cognates and English cognates were kind of interesting, and yeah, I just kind of got into it from there. And at first, I was more of a syntax person, but then my interest started changing more to phonology once I started becoming more concerned with like actual concrete data. I just a lot of times in syntax, it seems like a lot of authors are just using their own internal intuitions to make these huge sweeping arguments, and I just kind of don't like that much anymore. So yeah.
Well, like for example, the number of movies Nicolas Cage have been in can perfectly correlate with the homicide rate.
Yeah.
Although I can probably see a causal link there.
Tell us about your adventures in Australia, which unfortunately Tom Hanks has the coronavirus. You've heard about it, but
yeah, I've actually been living here now for about 4 years.
How are the spiders?
Not that bad actually, but my fiance's family's gets really scared of them sometimes.
Tell us about your adventures over there and your any interactions with Aborigines.
I have met a couple of Aborigines, but not. I haven't like had super lengthy conversations with any of them. They mostly live in rural areas. So in Brisbane there is a noticeable Aborigine minority, but in Melbourne, where I lived my first year, there's not really. It was just kind of it's mostly British immigrants and then some Greek immigrants and also some like Indians and Chinese immigrants and stuff like that. Yeah, but when you go up to the rural areas, you see more Aborigines like running convenience stores and things like that. And there's a couple of towns in the Northern Territory where they're a demographic majority, but I haven't really been to any of those.
That is interesting. But, it was nice having you on and going over the topics.
Yeah, it was nice talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Say hi to Crash Bandicoot when you see him.
Who's that?
Bandicoot.
Crash Bandicoot, you don't know who he is?
No.
PlayStation mascot? Oh, come on, man.
Sorry, I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, I know who he is.
Who is he?
He's like in games.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well,
Anyway,
nice to see you.
Yeah.
And this is Mr. Brass and my friend Code and Brian Collins signing out.